We are Rubio, Isabel, Bartolomé, and Nuno Madureira. And even though we have a compromise with it, with a title in Spanish, which is Historias nucleares, hispano-portuguesas, estado, negocios, y fracasos, our presentation for this Congress is going to be done in English. Why is it interesting to research about the Spanish-Portuguese relationship and nuclear business when, in fact, Portugal doesn't have any nuclear reactors so far? So only have a reactor that is an experimental reactor, but not nuclear energy, while Spain actually did have built 10 reactors and have a much bigger, ambitious project of nuclear. What we think is that this story of two countries doing opposite things with the nuclear energy actually share interesting traits that share institutions and companies and environmental movements that tell us some things about how the Iberian market in energy works, and maybe it's useful for other technologies such as gas. It's also discussed in this Congress, but also other forms of electricity or even the oil sector. Even though they have this strong divergent story, for the most part, this is a story of cooperation. Portugal and Spain both cooperated through the 60s. Both countries at the time were corporatist fascist regime under military rule. Probably that facilitated the relationship. Both the Portuguese Estado Novo and the Spanish Francoist regime enforced very nationalist, conservative, Roman Catholic values on the population and the ways of doing business, restricted the speech of the association, applied censorship to the press. So in many ways, they were very alike in how they ruled the countries in the 60s. And when this new energy appeared around, this new technology, the nuclear energy appeared around, they reacted similarly. Both nations created similar institutional structures, both called Junta de Energía Nuclear. We happen in both languages to have exactly the same spelling and the same name. Both institutions exchange scientists and students and share resources, both capital and man-made, over that period. And both countries started to have experimental reactors in the 60s when actually nobody had commercial nuclear energy. And in both countries, the idea was to start commercial or investigate the possibility of using nuclear technology commercially based. It's also true that both countries also cooperated not only on the front of the commercial nuclear energy, but also on the research that had to do with other ambits of nuclear energy and also in uranium mining and other parts of the nuclear cycle that we are not going to take on this presentation. We are going to concentrate on the nuclear civil production of electricity. For the most part, that collaboration was informal until 1971, when actually both countries signed an agreement of cooperation and development of the civil uses of nuclear power. That's a state-level agreement. That agreement institutionalized the pre-existing cooperation on nuclear research and exploitation of natural resources, but also on the knowledge and installations. For Spain, it was one more of the many nuclear treaties that it has signed. Spain was among the earliest signatures of bilateral cooperation agreements in nuclear things, having signed with the US in 1955, with France in 1956, with Great Britain in the 60s, and with Canada and Italy in 65. So signing while with Portugal was adding one more nuclear treaty to the cooperation treaties that Spain had at the time. Like all the other assignments or agreements that Spain signed at the time, the nuclear cooperation with Portugal had no reference to safety or sale regulations or anything that was directly related to the safety of nuclear energy. But that in 1971 was quite common and wasn't, it's not an exception that we made here. It simply wasn't included anywhere. That collaboration that so far I have mentioned stayed at a very institutional level, that is government to government or the junta to the junta, also existed at a more private level among the companies. Nuno might tell us what is available on the Portuguese side on these stories. That this first phase of collaboration I just described from the 1950s to about 1974, which is the end of the dictatorships, is basically that of a collaboration between those two fascist regimes. Both countries have ambitions to build nuclear powers, as you said. There has that agreement among the countries, and this idea of maybe building something together that might serve both electrical market. In both countries, they also share this. The idea of building nuclear power plants was told to the public as this idea of progress, the technology, the industry, a creation of jobs. Both countries walk into democracy almost at the same time, and that democratic transition had some effects on the nuclear planning on both sides. One of the most visible impacts on the nuclear realm is the fact that the nuclear social movements, the anti-nuclear social movements, could actually speak out in both countries. That will have different effects, with probably widely discussed, because it is my opinion that despite the importance of the social movements on both sides of the border, it is probably more of an economic and financial decision to stand down on the nuclear projects in Portugal and to abandon Ferrell and the Spanish nuclear moratorium as well. So in this sort of second phase that will go from 74 to 86, while Portugal still had some ambitions to build the Ferrell nuclear power plant, and Spain keep going ahead with these nuclear power plants, but with a smaller program, the cooperation was still there. Both countries modernized their institutions regarding nuclear, changing the Juntas de Energía Nuclear in the case of Spain to the Consejo de Seguridad Nuclear, and in Portugal to the GPSN, institutions that were becoming more of a regulator than a promoter that had on the previous phase. But that second phase will end up, will differentiate from the next one the moment that the Portuguese decide to give up completely nuclear power in 1987, with the final decision not to build Ferrell and declare Portugal a nuclear-free country. And that opened a sort of a third phase closer to the present, in which we have what we have now, which is Spain is a medium-sized nuclear country with all the nuclear power plants mostly owned by private companies, private utilities that were the ones that built them up, with Portugal not being a nuclear country. And Portugal, together with the European Union, has been enforcing some sort of vigilance over the Spanish nuclear realm, whether the extension of life of Almaraz, or whether it's the opening of uranium mines in Salamanca. The Portuguese have been acting as an external vigilant actor on the Spanish nuclear activities. And that will be a very quick summary of what is the long history of the Spanish nuclear relationship, in which we still have many things to figure out, and that's why we got together with Nuno and Isabel to try to see what the Portuguese archives can tell us about, particularly the first two phases of collaboration, on why those attempts to build nuclear power plants from the private utilities, joint plants, never actually came to be. Nuno, can you illustrate us a little bit more of what is known and unknown on this relationship?
Thank you very much, and good morning. As aforementioned by Rubio, the fact that some nuclear power plants of the Spanish program were in the 60s set to be located in rivers close to the Portuguese border, or even at the border, fostered the idea of creating joint nuclear power stations for the use of the common water resources used for reactor refrigeration. I will take a look at this eventful moment to demonstrate that this Iberian cooperation was an original historical development from Portuguese point of view. Since it marks a turnabout in Portugal's nationalist nuclear conception of the early phases. The Portuguese view of nuclear as an opportunity, a nationalist opportunity, had two driving forces. The first was the idea of taking advantage of Portuguese uranium resource to launch a whole development program of nuclear formation and even nuclear installation. This driving force was held by the Nuclear Energy Board, GEN, like in Spain, and it attempted to take advantage of a monopoly in the conception of uranium and uranium ores to make a lot of technical and scientific programs. The second driving force of Portuguese nationalism, and here nationalism is more an autarkic sense, was defended by a company called Portuguese Company of Nuclear Industries, which gathered all enterprises in Portugal in the chemical, manufacturing, industrial, and transportation sector that were interested in grabbing a share of the orders for Portuguese nuclear reactors. So their interest was mainly to kind of nationalize all goods and services that could be provided by Portuguese firms. To resume, our argument is that the appearance of the Portuguese-Spanish deals for the creation of joint nuclear power stations dealt a blow in this conception. Now, in the 60s and 70s and 80s, we have three attempts to create a joint power station. The first was a power station located in Guadiana River, in the southernmost part of the Guadiana River, and this paved the way to a common study projected in 1966 between the Spanish Companhia Sevillana de Eletricidade and the Portuguese Empresa Termonuclear Portuguesa, later CPA, aiming at a 50-50% split in the power produced for a 500 megawatts power station. The second opportunity happened 2 years later in 1968, but now into Tagus River, between a pool of three Spanish companies, again, Sevillana de Eletricidade was one of them, and on the other side, the same Portuguese semi-public company, Empresa Termonuclear Portuguesa, CPA. This plan envisioned a split of 75% Spanish ownership and 25% Portuguese ownership of the Almaraz power plant, like the other one, also with a plan for a 500 megawatts capacity. Less known, but finally and thirdly, in 1982, a new possibility of cooperation happened, now between Iberdrola and the same Empresa Termoelétrica Nuclear Portuguesa, now transformed into the national company ADP. This plan was around a power plant located northwards in Douro, in River Douro, and called Sayago. It planned a split between a 72% Spanish ownership and a 28% Portuguese ownership. Even though these plans never saw the daylight, they indicate that at some point in history, Portuguese authorities, and I mean Portuguese authorities because besides the companies, both Portuguese and Spanish governments were always involved in these negotiations, accept the fact that the first power plant in Portugal could be a joint Portuguese-Spanish company. Now, joint cooperation would mean some developments that run against the early idea of the Portuguese nationalist vision of nuclear power. Namely, joint cooperation would mean the acceptance of Spanish technological leadership as well as the acceptance of the ongoing orders with major international suppliers for the supply of central reactor component. In second, it would mean the subordinance of the supply of Portuguese uranium oxides to the fact that the supply must be competitive. Finally and thirdly, it also means that issues related to security, surveillance, and management would be held mainly by the Spanish authorities. Well, the nationalist view held by Portuguese authorities and by Portuguese firms, what we have found is at least 2 complaints by Portuguese companies denouncing the deals with the Spanish. These are metallomechanic companies, the largest one in Portugal, and what they argue in this complaint against the deals made by the government are some points. First, that if we are going to cooperate with Spain in building nuclear reactor, Portuguese suppliers would be limited to supply Spanish subcontractors. Second, that what is planned will carry on a very low Portuguese participation in civil works and construction service. The third point is that there is a huge technological imbalance. So we have a fight back from the enterprises saying that we are not interested in these kinds of deals because they represent a downsizing of what we expect to be the Portuguese participation in a first nuclear power plant. Against these arguments, and to finish, we have some growing measure of support from the concessionária Portuguese company, which was the Empresa Termoelétrica Portuguesa, later CPE, later EDP. And they defended the project with the Spanish because, well, this project allowed the anticipation of the deadline for the first Portuguese nuclear power plant. So it would represent an acceleration of the whole process and an clearing in the installation of nuclear power stations. Second, it represented a shortcut and a lift for technical and engineering formation of Portuguese workers. On the negative side, the Portuguese company only saw the problem that maybe it was too soon to integrate something like 300 megawatts into Portuguese network, because this is a huge size that would cause problems in the management of the whole electrical network. So we have here a possible cause for the failure of the project. It's not for sure the single cause, but what we can say is that the main Portuguese suppliers were not too much fond of the idea of a Portuguese-Spanish cooperation. And along with other regions, namely financial support, we may find here the reasons why this has failed.
I will say something about the source. We have consulted Foreign Affairs, the Presidency, Salazar's papers, and the financial ministries, and the main company, and on all the branches of this main company in Portugal. But we couldn't find same sources on the Spanish side. So, as Nuno have said, we are trying to build the story only with these kind of sources. In this Portugal and Spain case, we have, I could say that it's a kind of tension between competition and cooperation between these two countries. Nationalism was so important as financial constrictions. So I think that Spaniards and Portuguese were were not close friends. They were all, both of them, suspecting that something could go wrong. Apart from this main thing that were the center of this relationship, I would like to work on other additional issues, particularly water, the international border agreements between water. That is a very long story between the two countries, and the other is uranium. I think that's enough.
So, well, thank you for paying attention. And if you have any questions, we'll be happy to answer them after the talk. Bye.